Pharmacy Times. Everything pharmacy, every day.
I think there's two misconceptions that come up all the time, and it's because of mis and disinformation. One is that we don't need to lower cholesterol, that if we have it high, that's what our body needs. And that simply is not true. I'm not certain exactly why we're back down this wormhole, but what we do know based on proof and based on evidence that if your cholesterol is elevated, there's an increased risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, things like heart attacks, ischemic stroke, peripheral arterial disease, and an increased risk of cardiovascular death. And I think that some patients hear things differently. And I think nature's case example, if pharmacists get into a pinch where they can't convince a patient that high cholesterol is bad, is to look at people with genetic disorders that have either heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia or homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. These are people that have LDL cholesterols, which is the bad cholesterol that's above 190, and in some cases, well above 190. There's absolutely, beyond shadow of doubt, an increased risk of early heart disease in that population. And it has been attributed to atherogenic lipoproteins, which is LDL cholesterol or apolipoprotein B. So the proof of concept is still a misunderstanding. The second is misinformation about the benefits of our first line treatment to lower LDL cholesterol, which are statin-based therapies. These are old medicines, very proven in multiple clinical trials, but we hear mixed messages about their overall benefit. They have been one of the most evidence-based drug classes in the history of healthcare. But sometimes we hear, I guess, too much about the downsides of patients that might experience muscle-related symptoms in particular. So I think that's probably a misconception, which is the benefit versus risk, which strongly outweighs benefit in the majority of patients. Not everybody, but the majority of patients. PCSK9 inhibitors really have exploded. These represent, aside from statins, the real high intensity options. And we've had a variety of different types of PCSK9 inhibitors. We have the monoclonal antibodies, which are evolocumab and alirocumab, two of them that are very well evidenced to not only lower LDL cholesterol, but to reduce cardiovascular events in a broad population of patients who have risk factors. There's also a second type of PCSK9 inhibitor, which is inclisiran. Inclisiran actually decreases the production of PCSK9. And PCSK9 simply is just a protein that inhibits our body's ability to lower LDL cholesterol. So if you get rid of that inhibiting substance, our body can lower LDL cholesterol to a better ability, and cholesterol drops 50+%. Inclisiran works in the liver by decreasing production of that protein where the monoclonal antibodies bind up what's circulating. We even have a third class of agents, which are there's only one drug in that called lorlaodelcibep. It's an injectable drug which actually lowers LDL cholesterol very well, recently approved by the FDA. So the current landscape with the PCSK9 inhibitors is that we have a drug class that with the monoclonals is well evidenced to reduce cardiovascular events. All of them lower LDL cholesterol very well, 50+%, depending on which one you look at, but they're all injectable products. So enlicitide decanoate, which is an oral PCSK9, has released data recently at the 2025 AHA Scientific Sessions meeting, showing their profile on how this oral PCSK9 inhibitor lowers LDL cholesterol and is comparable in efficacy to the monoclonal antibodies. So we're looking at over 50% reduction in LDL cholesterol. That was released at the AHA Scientific Sessions. And to have an oral agent that is in the PCSK9 targeted therapies that can give that power and LDL reduction really is robust because not everybody is amenable to an injection, and injections do have sometimes other things that come along, not just injection site reactions as a possible side effect, but sometimes mass production of an injectable is different than mass production of an oral agent. So the importance of the enlicitide decanoate product is what was released is efficacy data of high reductions in LDL cholesterol, which is comparable to the injectable PCSK9 inhibitors. And also maybe the hope that this can be more deployable to a broader patient population as far as an option that can sort of fit the scheme of how patients usually take their maintenance medications. We will have outcomes data for that particular drug. There's also another oral PCSK9 inhibitor that's in the works too. It's a little further back in development than elicitide decanoate, but this field of PCSK9 inhibitors will continue to expand. If you haven't heard of the Vesalius study and you manage patients who have lipid disorders, you need to read it. It, in my opinion, is a game changer. So this also is fully published. It was one of the TIMI trials, which is the organization that does all the big cardiovascular studies in the field of prevention and treatment. So this was a large, well-designed study. It was a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. And what they've looked at was a broad range of patients that were either secondary prevention patients, but without a history of that myocardial infarction. So they had stable coronary disease, or some of them had even cerebral vascular disease or PAD. And another portion of the patients were called high risk primary prevention patients with diabetes. So they had a mix of primary and secondary prevention, and they've looked at patients that have not been classically studied as the very high risk population with ASCVD. They used a similar platform and they looked at patients who are already on maximally tolerated lipid-lowering therapy or LDL-lowering therapy, which is mostly statin-based therapy, but still had LDLs that were unacceptably high. And they chose an LDL of 90 or higher, or non-HDL of 120 or higher, or even apolipoprotein B of 80 or higher. So all markers, depending on which guideline you look at, which clearly is uncontrolled and could be reduced further to reduce events. They randomized these patients already on treatment, but not at their quote goal, to either receive placebo or evolocumab. And after a period of 4.6 years, their LDL went down from, on average, about 122 down to definitely a lower range. The people on evolocumab had a median LDL cholesterol after about a year of 45 versus about 109 in the placebo group, because it went down from 120s to 109 because of lifestyle modifications, most likely. But the most important thing is they demonstrated across the board a reduction in both a 3-point MACE and a 4-point MACE. MACE stands for major adverse cardiovascular events. And when you, as a study design, pick a 3-point MACE, it's pretty bold because it's hard to achieve a reduction in a 3-point MACE unless you have a robust clinical intervention, and they met their outcome. But really, to tease this, so you may be thinking, oh, another PCSK9 monoclonal antibody study that showed benefit. Yeah, got that, done that. But this is a different patient population. It's not the classic very high risk patients who have a recent acute coronary syndrome or stable ASCVD with a lot of cardiovascular risk factors. They had patients, some of them were primary prevention people with diabetes. Some of these other people, 1,000 of them, had never had an event, but they had qualifying coronary artery disease because of an elevated coronary artery calcium score. They never had a heart attack. They just had that. And we have a lot of patients that are now getting coronary artery calcium scores, and it indicates subclinical atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. 1,000 of them were included in this study. So the benefits of aggressive LDL lowering therapy with PCSK9 inhibition really was expanded. And I think as far as how this impact patients and clinical recommendations is it will give us evidence to treat more aggressively some of our high and higher risk primary and secondary prevention patients. It does fit a gap because, you know, primary prevention diabetes patients, we know statins are beneficial, but now we know adding on evolocumab or a PCSK9 inhibitor in general does provide long-term benefit. And that benefit in the patients that have elevated coronary artery calcium scores, I think, is a home run. So we will see probably increased use of LDL lowering therapies, in particular, the PCSK9 inhibitors. I do want to highlight, though, that most of these patients are already treated with maximally tolerated statin therapy. So this doesn't replace statin therapy, it augments it. This is a hard one because we know as a medical community, the dose that patients start on often is the dose they end up on long term. So there's the concept, do you start at the dose you need or do you titrate up to it? And either are acceptable if we do our job. And our job could be either starting the right intensity of a dose as your initial therapy or appropriately titrating up. With strained resources, having patients come back for lipid panels, it can occur in many systems, but I can see why patients fall through the cracks because they don't simply get the ongoing monitoring that is recommended by our evidence-based guidelines. So the opportunity for pharmacists, I guess it's multifaceted. I would like pharmacists to have more than one trick or tool to pull out of their pocket. And I'm always an advocate for if somebody's high risk or very high risk, start with a high intensity statin regimen. Don't bother with starting low and titrating up. So start with what they need. Most patients that are high risk or worse need at least a 50% reduction in LDL cholesterol. And if you start at a moderate intensity statin dose, good luck. You're not going to get it. You're just prolonging the time to get to goal. And if you have an integrated system where patients can wait and go through those titrations, then maybe that's fine. But often we don't have the luxury of that. So starting with the right drug first is important. Downside of that is you may have patients that experience side effects that require them to go down on their dose. So that's the trade-off there. Um, and that would require ongoing monitoring too. So I think for pharmacists, some of the recommendations that I have for maximizing reduction is try to recommend what is appropriate for initial therapy. Partner with your patients to see if they are agreeable to that plan. That's called shared decision making. We may have to pivot and be willing to pivot and start a different approach if the need is there from your patient. There may be some patients too, and going beyond what's recommended based on our hardest evidence, that may benefit from a lower dose of a statin, but it would be in combination with another non-statin to get them to their goal. I think the worst thing we can do is identify a patient that needs a 50+% reduction in LDL cholesterol, which would be a high risk or worse patient, and giving them a low intensity or moderate intensity regimen. If you're not going to use the proper dose of a statin, team it up with something that will at least provide it to be a high intensity regimen. Commonly, that would involve another old drug such as ezetimibe, which has been around for a long period of time. I think we need to maybe pivot a bit and actually channel some of what we do with hypertension into the dyslipidemia world, which in some patients may be starting with two drugs as initial therapy. We need to remember what patients are like as far as what's in their mindset. Patients are not always health literate, and we need to communicate to them in language that they understand. It may not be the same for every individual patient. So I think it starts with, if you think about patient communication and shared decision making, a portion of that is communication, but effective communication. So being able to talk patient language. Sometimes it's a verbal conversation. Some people learn more visually and they need to see things. But I think explaining the purpose of treatment. I'm a big advocate that every pharmacist should be able to explain what a medication is for, how to take it, and what to expect. The sort of basic model of patient education, I think, can be applicable to any ongoing chronic therapy. But part of that explanation is not just how to take your medicine. It's about what it's for. And with dyslipidemia, some patients do need to understand that we're treating you with a medication and lifestyle to prevent something that you don't have. And you may not have any symptoms. We often think of hypertension as the silent killer. So is dyslipidemia because people don't complain that their cholesterol is elevated. They don't feel it. So getting them to commit to something that they take every day or an injection that they take every couple weeks can be a leap of faith for a lot of patients. So we need to explain to them why this treatment is recommended. Sometimes we need to distill the long-term benefits in an understandable communication. Some patients may respond to things that are on the internet in a good way or a bad way, because I don't like referring people to just go to the internet to find things through Dr. Google, because that could lead them down a wormhole or give them more dis or misinformation. So, but referring to trustworthy resources, whether it's from the National Lipid Association or the Mayo Clinic or NIH, or American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology. If you dive into there, you can find a lot of very good patient-facing information. Even the Family Heart Foundation has has some excellent resources to actually enhance patients to understand their disease. And I think that's part of the communication. Secondly, is the importance of adherence. And C. Everett Koop, I always quote him. He's one of our former Surgeon Generals. He said, drugs don't work in people who don't take them. And it's so true. It's simple. But if patients are not adherent, if they don't fully engage in a treatment plan, nothing's going to happen. You don't take the medicine, no benefit. It's not a failure of anybody in particular. It's just reality. So motivating patients to be adherent with their medicine. And we're pretty fortunate with lipid treatments that it's usually pretty simple. At worst, good regimens are a pill once a day. And sometimes it's an injection at a certain time frequency. So I'm not certain that, we need to really work on optimizing how people take their medicine. I think most of our treatments are relatively straightforward. People are fully informed, but we need to maybe understand that sometimes patients need a choice, need to understand the side effect profile, and maybe understand that if one treatment regimen doesn't work well for them, that we have option 2 and option 3 and option 4. So engaging patients in that shared decision making, and perhaps the biggest thing I'll leave you with from adherence is you're not going to help somebody with adherence if you're not looking for it. So we need to look for objective ways to assess adherence. That can include asking open-ended questions such as, how do you remember to take your medicines regularly? How often do you miss a dose in a given week or a month? And looking at the power of our electronic health records. Often we can see fill data, see if patients actually are filling their medicines, not just getting them refilled, but seeing if they're getting filled in a pharmacy and claimed in a claim being submitted to their insurance company. Those are things that we can do. Another way of objectively looking at adherence is simply looking at the biomarker, looking at the LDL reduction, seeing how far it's dropped, because we often experience that patients don't give us any indications they're not adherent. But when we look at their LDL, if it went from 130 to 120, they're probably not taking their regimen. With population health, I see the opportunity. It's not perfect in population health with lipid management because we don't have LDL as an endorsed quality measure by CMS. There is resurgence. It used to be a quality measure. And post-MI patients, we used to achieve getting their LDL less than 100, and it was a quality measure that would relate to better reimbursements from insurance companies. That fell away in, I think, 2014. There is a resurgence to get it re-recognized as a quality measure, and that fits into the population health world. So we don't have that right now, but what we do have is some measures of using just statin-based regimen in certain high-risk populations, ones where evidence has proven that statin therapy is beneficial. And the benefit of population health is we can systematically identify patients who are in what we call care gaps, people that are not on therapy that is evidence-based to benefit them. So we can identify people through population health approaches. Also, another part of population health is using integrated care teams, and that does involve pharmacists. We do a good job at getting patients to recommended goals or targets of therapy. So deploying pharmacists actually within a team-based approach with population health initiatives to identify patients who need therapy can be a winning formulation. We haven't perfectly found the way to fund those. We do know that quality is important in healthcare because we don't reduce cardiovascular disease unless we provide quality care in patients, and which includes lifestyle also. It's not always about drug therapy, but I think that what a pharmacist can do is we can identify and manage medications to get to therapeutic goals. We can promote lifestyle modifications in an appropriate manner, which includes exercise and eating well, eating a heart healthy diet. And there's proof in the literature that pharmacists do this well, not just with diabetes, not just with hypertension, but also with dyslipidemia. I don't think you missed anything, but the world of dyslipidemia management is exciting again. At one point in time, it was stagnant. It was stagnant because we didn't have a lot of new therapies that were going to be introduced. But we're at the point right now, we're on the brink in 2026, buckle your seatbelt because things are going to get fun, like a roller coaster. We're going to have more new drugs. We just had a new LDL lowering therapy, lorildalcibep, the third generation of a PCSK9 inhibitor. In the near future, This year, we'll have new guidelines from the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association. So that's going to be exciting. We continue to have new evidence. The Vesalia is just hot off the press, which actually it continually challenges us to be on top of things to provide the most evidence-based therapy to our patients. And there's going to be more new therapies. We're going to see oral PCSK9 inhibitors in the near future that lower LDL cholesterol. We're going to see probably a drug called obicetrapib, another LDL-lowering therapy, which is a new drug class that looks very promising that it might be available. We may see even more than one oral PCSK9 inhibitor over the next several years. And we'll also have a lot with other lipoproteins that beyond LDL lowering, after you've gotten LDL lowering satisfied, there may be some patients that have elevated lipoprotein A or LP little a, we call that. And we're on the brink of having therapeutic entities in agents that can lower that, which may be really good for certain high-risk patients that have elevated lipoprotein A. So it's going to get exciting, and there's more of a reason for pharmacists to engage not only in continue education, but also being abreast and informed of the latest and greatest from an evidence-based perspective.
Pharmacy Times. Everything pharmacy, every day.